I'm going to show how to make beef tallow for the purpose of consumption. When done right, this tallow will be shelf stable and will not require refrigeration. This process will remove the impurities as well as any residual water. Therefore, you do not want to add water with this process. The practice of adding water is usually done for those who are making candles or soap. I like to work in 5-pound batches. My choice fat would be beef suet, which is fat from around the organs such as the kidneys. However, regular beef fat trimmings work well too. The first step is to remove as much red meat and non-fat tissue using a knife. Simply trim away as much meat from the fat as you can. The key is to take your time piece by piece. Don't worry if there's some residual meat remaining. However, the longer you spend trimming, the purer the end product will be. Collect these chunks in a bowl. The goal is to end up with the purest chunks of fat as you can. Once again, the residual impurities will be separated later. The next step is to grind the fat. If you do not have a grinder, you'll at least need to dice the fat into very small pieces. If you are using a grinder, partially freeze the fat by placing it in the freezer for about 30 minutes before grinding. This will lower the risk of the fat gumming up and clogging the grinding plate. Next, grind using a fine plate as seen here. The goal is to get the pieces as small as you can. If you find that grinding is difficult, start with a coarser plate and move down to a fine plate. However, I have had no problem using the fine plate after the 30-minute freeze time. Once again, if you do not have a grinder, just try making the pieces as small as possible. You could even use a food processor if you have one. Once ground, the fat can now be rendered. Load the fat into a large crock pot as seen here. Next, add about 3 tablespoons of kosher salt to the top. This is the amount of salt I use per 5 pounds, but the measurements don't have to be perfect. The salt is used to help draw out the impurities and make a cleaner product. Next, return the lid to the crock pot and set it on low heat. Be sure to check the contents as it heats. When you see the fat starting to melt, stir it well and return the lid. Continue stirring throughout this process until all the fat has been melted. Search for chunks of fat to measure your progress. Continue heating and stirring until all has melted and only solids are left behind. When completely rendered, you will see clear tallow with solids that look like gristle and burger. Depending on the crock pot, this whole process could take anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. At this point, turn the crock pot off and prepare to strain the contents. Use a wire mesh strainer as seen here. Purchase some cheesecloth and line the strainer, creating a very fine filter for catching solids and the impurities. Once the strainer has been prepared, place a large metal bowl in the sink and set the strainer in the bowl. Then pour the tallow and the solids into the strainer in this manner. Be sure to wear gloves or oven mitts. The contents will be very hot. Now lift the strainer up and catch the tallow in the bowl. Then, wearing a heat-resistant glove, squeeze the remaining tallow from the solids within the cheesecloth. Next, set the bowl aside and allow it to cool for a couple hours. As it cools and sits, the tallow will rise to the top and any water and impurities will sink to the bottom. Once cool enough, place in the refrigerator overnight. When you remove it from the refrigerator the next day, you will find that the tallow has risen to the top and is solidified. Beneath the tallow in the bottom of the bowl lies the impurities. These have settled to the bottom and need to be removed. Break the tallow loose from the bowl in this manner. Then lift the tallow from the bowl as seen here. The impurities will be left behind. These will need to be discarded and the bowl will need to be cleaned. Next, place the tallow block with the bottom side up. Use a knife to scrape off any remaining impurities in this manner. It will appear as a thin layer that has a darker appearance than the tallow. Take your time scraping this film off. Be as thorough as possible. You do not want any left behind. Once the impurities have been removed, the tallow is ready for purification. This step is to make sure the tallow is completely clean of impurities. To do this, remelt the tallow in the crock pot. Be sure to stir at random to help melt and lower the risk of burning. Once again, this could take anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. After the tallow has melted, you should not find any solids within. It is now ready to be strained once again. Making sure the strainer has been cleaned, reline it using a new cheesecloth and set in the bowl. Next, pour in the tallow, straining it using the same method as shown earlier. The cheesecloth should have no evidence of solids, and the tallow should be clear with no water or impurities at the bottom. However, if you suspect any, you should repeat this process over again by refrigerating overnight and purifying the next day. Purified tallow is easy to store. A mason jar is the perfect vessel for storing tallow. With the use of a canning funnel, fill the jar with hot melted tallow. Then top with a new canning lid and secure with a ring. Once the tallow has been completely cooled and solidified, it should appear fairly white and without any impurities. Finally, store in a cool, dark place in a cabinet or pantry.